This video explains how to add a role to a server in HostingController. In HostingController, each server added to the cluster has to have a role assigned to it. For instance, a server can be added with an Exchange, SharePoint, or Active Directory role. The role assigned to the server determines the purpose of the server in the cluster. Here, we will demonstrate the addition of an Exchange server to the cluster and the assignment of an Exchange role to it. In the case of Exchange, there is no need to install HostingController on the actual Exchange machine. The HC control server will communicate directly with the actual Exchange machine via remote PowerShell. In the panel, we will only include a hypothetical server with a friendly name. This hypothetical server will point to the actual Exchange server. In fact, all application servers are added to HostingController as roles. If a server already hosts data, the data can be imported into HostingController using HostingController's built-in migration tools. For instance, if there is an existing Exchange deployment, the Exchange data can be imported into HostingController. To add a role to a server, first, you need to enable the relevant service globally through cluster settings. To configure cluster settings, log into the control panel as the global admin. Cluster settings are only available to the global admins. You will land on the dashboard. Hit the Configurations cog on the top and navigate to Cluster Settings. Cluster settings allow you to define globally the various services and versions that would be available to the customers. The HostingController cluster will only offer those services that have been enabled for the cluster at the top. Click the appropriate tab and enable the relevant service. In this case, we will enable Microsoft Exchange and specify the desired version. Then hit the Save button. Once the service has been defined globally, add its server to the cluster. To add a server, navigate back to the Configurations cog and hit Servers under Server Manager. Click the Add Server button and scroll down to the relevant category. For Exchange, the relevant category is On-Premises Enterprise. Click the category. Give a friendly name to the server. In the case of Exchange, this is a hypothetical server, without any physical existence. It only serves as an identifier in the panel. In reality, the control server communicates with the actual Exchange server directly via remote PowerShell. Now assign the role to the server. Assigning the Microsoft Exchange role to it devotes it to the provisioning of Exchange resources. Then hit the Add Server and Configure button. On the next screen, select an appropriate version of Exchange for the server in case more than one versions have been defined in the cluster settings. Specify the IP of the actual Exchange server. Specify the domain administrator for the Exchange server. Provide the password for the domain administrator and check connectivity. The Check Connectivity button sends a PowerShell command to the Exchange server that establishes a connection between HostingController and the actual Exchange server. Failed connectivity prevents a valid connection from being established. To investigate a failed connection, you can always visit the logs. After a successful connection, choose a mode for mailbox databases. Exchange mailbox databases can either be selected manually at the time of provisioning of OUs or the assignment decision can be left entirely to Exchange. If the manual option is selected, customers can select a mailbox database manually at the time of the creation of an OU and mail domain. If the automatic option is selected, the assignment decision is left to Exchange. In this option, customers will not be displayed databases at the time of OU and mail domain creation. Instead, Exchange will decide which database to assign. Specify the Exchange CAS server credentials. Select the relevant domain controller. Provide the domain controller credentials and check its connectivity. The Check Connectivity button checks connectivity through DAP with the domain controller. If the connectivity fails, you can always check the exceptions logged in HostingController. After a successful connection, with the domain controller, browse the Active Directory root path and select the root organizational unit, under which the users will be created. Finally, hit the Save button. The server with the Exchange role will be added to the cluster. After the server has been added, you can provision new Exchange resources by navigating to the provisioning menu on the left and hitting Exchange under it. In the HostingController environment, each physical server can run one or more application servers. These application servers in turn are added to HostingController as service roles. They are hypothetical servers, added to HostingController with friendly names. Application servers represent various applications such as Exchange, SharePoint, Hyper-V, and so on. HostingController makes it all easy to assign service roles to a server and confine that server to the provisioning of certain resources. Try HostingController today.